Hello, this is Michelle Miller, and today we're talking about biomes. And as an introduction, I just wanted to discuss the fact that there are different biomes, and the same biomes actually, on different continents. And so organisms have specific adaptations to a biome, like the desert biome, which can be found in North America as well as in Australia. And these are examples of organisms that you might find there. So this is what is referred to as the horned lizard. Sometimes people mistakenly call it a horny toad, but it's actually a lizard. So it's a reptile, not an amphibian. So this is the horned lizard. My pen isn't going to work today. And this one is commonly called a thorny devil, and it is found in Australia. And so even though they look very similar to one another, they are not related evolutionarily very closely. So this is actually an example of convergent evolution. So evolution is a change in a group of organisms over time, and con means coming together. And so these organisms have similar traits based upon the fact that they evolved to similar conditions rather than that they have a close ancestor. So this means that organisms look alike because they live in similar environments. Not because they are closely related evolutionarily. Okay. So these are organisms that are in desert biomes, but on two different continents. So if we look at a biome and organisms live in habitats, but they also have niches. And so when we look at habitats, this is a geographical region plus environmental conditions. So those could go hand in hand. So for example, if we're talking about the tropics rainforests tend to be near the equator. So that's their geographical region, and they tend to be very moist and have lots of rainfall, and that would be an environmental condition. Whereas a niche, and sometimes this is referred to by Europeans, sometimes say niche, but a niche is the totality of a species' environmental requirements. So horned toad's niche is different than just being a desert. It would take into consideration the prey that it needs to eat. It would take into consideration the predators. It would take into consideration where it lives specifically. Does it live in underground burrows? And maybe also if it needs mineral requirements and those kinds of things. So it's the entire of the environment. And this is important because organisms can share habitats, but they cannot share the exact same niche. And so there is a kind of a theory or a law in biology that is called the competitive exclusion principle. And this is the idea that no two species can share the exact same niche. Okay. So that they will change in response to competition between each other, so that they will have separate niches. And so this change is called splitting the niche. So for example, let's just hypothetically say we have two different examples of crickets. And so you could say that one cricket calls in the morning and one cricket calls at night. And so therefore they don't have the exact same niche. So they might have everything else similar to them, but they might mate, one might mate in the morning and one might mate at night. We could also look at aerial predators in terms of hawks versus owls. So hawks and owls can, and there's many different species in each of those groups, but they can share the same niche, but the hawk hunts during the day, whereas owls hunt during the night. So they've split the niche. So there is no competitive exclusion, say, between a barn owl and a red-tailed hawk. There's also different vultures. And one vulture hunts by seeing and locating its prey by sight, and one vulture finds its prey by smell. And so they have split the niche. And so that's the idea of the competitive exclusion principle, and why it's different. We need to distinguish between just the habitats that two organisms reside in, two species can reside in, versus the totality of all of the environmental requirements, which is referred to as the niche. So organisms have special adaptations to niches. And so in your book, they talk about plants, and they talk about environmental gradients. And so an environmental gradient is changes in the condition from one area to the next. So changes in the conditions from one area to the next. And a good example of this is looking at mountains, and we can look at elevation changes. And you can even see this, like, for example, if you live in Pendleton or you live nearby and you drive up the Blue Mountains, the environmental conditions change as you move up, so it becomes more moist. So there's more precipitation, more snow. And what you see is that down low, there's no trees, there's bushes. But as you move up, then you get to the tree line. And so this is just an example of a gradient, is looking at elevational changes. And so if we look at the example in your book from, let's see, I thought I had this example. Oh, I forgot to put that down. But in your book, they look at plant species and how they're distributed down low on a mountain. And as we move up, where we get more precipitation, then the change in the plant species, it changes, okay? So that's just an example of environmental elevation difference. So this is a diagram that shows precipitation, terrestrial, and also the temperature distributions. And so we can see that we see a gradient from as we move from the equator and we move up, so that would be latitudinal, so think ladder. So as we move up towards the poles or down towards the poles, those are latitudinal changes. And what we see is that there's latitudinal bands of changes. So notice right here in the red, this is very hot. And so this is where we see deserts, for example. And then obviously as we move towards the pole, it gets much more cooler. And then we see polar ice caps on the Arctic, and the Antarctic regions of the planet. Okay, so we can look at, this is where I was gonna go with this, population ranges. And so these population ranges can describe the distribution of species. And we can have a range where we can say, okay, this is the range, this is the range where we see where they survive, that's their geographical range. But then we can also see that this narrow their ability to survive, and then their reproductive range might be even narrower. So this would be, the example in your book uses an example of plants. And so as we move up in elevation, there's a change, right, in the distribution of plants and the types of plants. And so down low, it's very hot and very dry. And so we see creosote bushes, and then we see them morphing into junipers. And then at the very top, we see ponderosa pines. And so we can see that there are as a gradient here due to elevation. Okay, and this gradient is due to their ability to undergo photosynthesis at different amounts of water. So you'll notice here that the ponderosa pine, really early on, if water becomes a limiting factor, it cannot undergo photosynthesis. So it shuts down its ability to produce sugars. But if we look at the creosote bush, here you can see that even under really low amounts of water, they can still undergo photosynthesis. And so these are just specific adaptations to different conditions, different habitats in the environment. Okay, so we're going to start talking about terrestrial biomes today, and these are in contrast to the aquatic biomes that we're going to look at. And the things that limit the distribution or determine the distribution of terrestrial biomes, so we can say these are the limiting factors, are temperature, water, and sunlight. Okay, so most of the sunlight falls, the solar energy falls on the equator, but sometimes the equator is very cloudy, so actually a lot of that gets reflected back into outer space. And then when you have a lot of evaporation near the equator, that actually keeps things relatively cool, as opposed when you don't have a lot of evaporation and you don't have a lot of clouds, that can make things really hot during the day and cooler at night. So when we look at the first terrestrial biome, this would be the tropical rainforests. Okay, so this is just a reiteration of this idea of light, water, and temperature. And so this is the limiting factors for each of these. So for example, when we look at the Amazon, the limiting factor is light. And so that could be due to cloud coverage. But if you look at in North America, the limiting factor is kind of more towards water, temperature, and light. So it's kind of in the middle. So we have kind of all three of these things. And it could be because in the winter, there is not as much light. And so we only have a shorter than say the equator growing period. Plants can't grow all year around. And so these are the limiting factors: light, water, and temperature. Okay, so tropical rainforests, we see that they have a high primary productivity. Okay, so you should be familiar with that idea, right? They can take solar energy and convert it into sugar. They can uptake CO2 from the atmosphere, so they are a carbon sink. When we look at them, we see that they have a canopy. So trees are competing for access to light, and so oftentimes the trees will grow really large, right? And they form a canopy, and so not a lot of light will get down to the forest floor. And so oftentimes we have an open forest floor in many of those areas. This might not be the case near a trail or a road, however, because when we create a road, that changes the light conditions. And so near roads, tropical rainforests might have very dense undergrowth, but if you walk in far enough, then it kind of opens up and it is not as dense underneath. We have high diversity. So they're unlike our forests where, there might be, fir trees, Douglas fir, or there could be ponderosa pine. they could have, when we look at them, they could have 300 different species in 1 hectare, and which is a scientific, or actually a European measurement of an acre. So 300 different species in an acre. And because they are so diverse, when you think about it, they actually need pollinators. So pollinators are needed by the plants because the pollinators can find other plant individuals. So if it's so diverse, right, the sperm, which would be the pollen, needs to be taken from one tree to another. And so that typically is done by either insects, but it could also be done by birds. So they need pollinators to disperse, also to spread the pollen, but also in some cases to disperse the seeds. So when we look at tropical rainforests, the plants also have big leaves. And so I'll put that up here by primary productivity. So they have big leaves with a large surface area over which photosynthesis can take place. And this is because they do not need to be worried about losing water. So the big leaves can get light, but it's not a big problem with getting rid of or losing water to the environment because it's so humid in this particular area. So when we look at these diagrams, what this shows is that this shows in green the degrees Celsius, the temperature, right? And so you notice, let's see, actually, wait a minute. The yellow is the degrees Celsius. So you notice that it stays pretty much steady, the temperature year around, but in some cases we have a drier period of time, okay? In these particular instances, the temperature and the amount of precipitation stay relatively the same. So you notice where the tropical forests are, they are near the equator. And this is different than what we would call the tropical dry forests. So we have tropical rainforests, and then we have tropical dry forests. So Mexico, for example, has a lot of tropical dry forests. And these usually are 10 degrees to 25 degrees north and south of the equator. And rainfall is abundant, but it is seasonal. So what happens is that during the dry season, sometimes the trees will lose their leaves, or the leaves will actually fold up. And then when the rains come back, when the rains come back, the leaves will unfold. And so there's a little bit difference between rainforests, tropical rainforests, and tropical dry forests. Okay, so if we look at the next one, it's the tropical savannas. And when we think about the big African animals like, not camels, but if we think about rhinos and elephants and zebras and giraffes, this is where they are found. And when we look at this environment, we see that there is relatively stable temperatures, but there is a rainy season. So there is a distinct rainy season. And this rainy season tends to be shorter, and the dry season tends to be longer than what we see in dry tropical forests. And so there's generally not enough water to support lots of trees. So put not enough water. Okay, so instead we have grasses. So this is a grassland. And it is, during the dry season, the grasses will dry out. And so it is fire adapted. Okay. We also have lots of organisms that can eat grass and have bacteria in their guts that allow them to digest the grass. And grass is interesting because unlike herbaceous plants, it grows from the base up. So grass can withstand nibbling, whereas like other plants that grow from the tip of their plants cannot withstand frequent nibbling. And also plant grasses are more prone to fire because they can burn to the ground and then come back from the roots. And so this is important for that ecosystem. We also see that there is a lot of organisms that feed upon the detritus. And so when we look at this ecosystem, we see lots of termites, and we see dung beetles that also bury the dung of the large animals like elephants and lay their eggs on them. And then those eggs develop into larvae, and then they are able to break free. So that is the tropical forests. Notice that we have none in North America. So our tropical savanna, we do not have a tropical savanna, but we have a temperate grassland in the center of our country. Okay, so deserts. So notice that the deserts are generally about 30 degrees north and south, and they are characterized by hotter temperatures and low precipitation. So they don't really have a period of rain where they have a rainy season. Okay, so in the deserts, this is 30 degrees north and south of the equator. Evaporation exceeds precipitation. So one of the things about the rainforest is that evaporation happens in the morning and it produces clouds. I'll write that over again. And it produces clouds, and then the rain falls right back down. But here, clouds do not form readily. So evaporation exceeds precipitation. So there's a loss of water. And so we can definitely see that there's a change in the types of plants. They generally do not have broad leaves. They have narrow leaves, if they have leaves at all. When we look at the cacti actually got rid of their leaves and turned them into spines to protect themselves, and they store water in the body of their plant. And so animals, or you're dying of thirst, you can sometimes cut open a cactus and find water that's being stored there. So this very specific biome, it's a region, right? And it's found, this biome is found in different parts of the world based upon the light, the precipitation, and the temperature. So it's characterized by hotter temperatures and lower precipitation. Okay, so we can also find the Mediterranean woodland and scrubland. And so this is, for example, Southern California. And this is characterized by evergreen shrubs. And so if you like things like lavender, if you like if you like rosemary, and if you like thyme, right? These are things that are found in the Mediterranean. And these are adapted to mild winters and hot summers. One of the things that is interesting about these particular things is that they have lots of oil in them. So that's why we extract oil from them. And they are also prone to burning. And so we see that they have mild winters and hot summers. Okay. So they are also fire adapted. So they actually can burn. And then they are able to come back after a particular fire. So they're very resilient to fire. Okay. Temperate grasslands. And so this is what we see in the center of our continent, or North America in the United States. And we also see them over here, right, in Asia and in Europe. And there's also a grassland down in here. And so if you look at this distribution, here you can see that it tends to have warm summers but cold winters. And so when we see this, we have hot summers and we have cold winters here. An example is the Great Plains of North America. And so an example of the organisms that live here are the bison and also the prairie dogs. The prairie dogs, unfortunately, were kind of demonized by people because they thought the prairie dog towns were actually destructive to the grasslands. But when they started studying prairie dogs and bison, what they discovered is that the prairie dogs, when they defecate near their prairie dog towns, which used to be extensive, you can see research of these extensive prairie dog towns, they actually release nitrogen into the soil. And so bison actually prefer to eat in areas where the prairie dogs are located because the grass is more nutritious. And so there has been a push to get people to reintroduce prairie dogs into the environment and recreate those prairie dog towns. Now, a problem with that is that we eliminated and killed them down to just a small group of individuals. And so recolonizing might be a problem as well as with the bison, because there's not a lot of genetic diversity left in those particular organisms. Now, the interesting thing about the grasslands is that they can be really short, but as we move towards, in the United States, as we move towards like Oklahoma and Colorado, sometimes those grasslands can get really big. So you could have a long grass prairie where you could walk into the grassland and the grass could be above your head, versus a short grass prairie, which we might see up in like North Dakota, for example. So those are the temperate grasslands. Okay, so the forests around our area in Oregon are temperate forests. And so temperate forests can be evergreen. And so this would mean that they are coniferous. So this is different than being deciduous. So deciduous is just another strategy for surviving the winter. So you can be deciduous and you will lose your leaves. And so this would be, for example, like maples, right? Oaks, elms. So these have a strategy, rather than keeping their leaves and having to use energy to maintain them all winter long, they pull back their nutrients from the leaves and put it back into their roots, and then the leaves fall off. And so it's just a different strategy. And so we also have temperate rainforests on our coast. And so we have, when we look at, say, for example, if you've ever been to the San Juan Islands, or if you've ever been to the peninsula, those would be very wet, with large trees, with big canopies, very moist, temperate forests, but they also are sometimes referred to as temperate rainforests. Okay. Continuing on, we can talk about, oops, I missed one, boreal forests. And so boreal forests are only found in the northern hemisphere. So you can see that they create this, almost this band of trees that extend all the way across. And so this would be up in Alaska. And then if you think about like Russia, and if you think about Siberia. So the cool things about the boreal forest is that like in Siberia, we have the Siberian tiger that lives in the boreal forest. So this is a high latitude up near the poles. Many organisms will actually migrate, so they can migrate towards down, or they could also actually hibernate, right? And so when we look at this, the growing season is shorter than 6 months, so a short growing season. And we also see that there's a huge range between the warmest and then the coldest time of the year. And so there's a huge range in the temperatures. And when we look at some of the organisms that live here, this would be like the caribou. We could talk about the reindeer. We could talk about wolves. We could talk about Siberian tigers and grizzly bears. And we can also talk about migrating songbirds. So sometimes the birds that live down in the south, as I mentioned, might migrate in the summertime up to the boreal forests. And so they might spend part of their time up there. Okay, so we're almost done with the aquatic, or excuse me, not the aquatic, the terrestrial ecosystems. So in the very, very northernmost part, we see that there's a tundra. And so this is above the line of a boreal forests. So above the latitude of the boreal forests. The temperature range is less extreme than the boreal forest. But they have, because they're up high, they have a shorter growing season. So these does not support trees. So there's no trees here. So we have like mosses, and we have lichen, and we have grasses in this area. And this is where we have permafrost. So you might have heard about permafrost, because permafrost is where the soil remains below zero for consecutive periods of time. So like for 2 or more years, the soil, the permafrost is frozen. And so the permafrost is starting to thaw out. And then you see, I didn't get a picture of this, but you can see that some of these big round holes that are forming way up high are actually due to the thawing out of the permafrost. And so this is important for climate change. And so permafrost is found in the tundra regions. Okay, so the thing about our environment is, specifically the terrestrial environment, is that we have actually taken over a lot of the biomes. And so we can actually talk about how we've created biomes of ourselves by using different environments. And so those are called anthropogenic biomes. And there tend to be 5 categories that we can kind of put them into. So these are human-made biomes. So we have cities, and these would be dense settlements. We have villages. I don't know, Pendleton might be a village. And croplands. We have rangelands. Think about BLM land. And then we have forested lands. Now the interesting thing is that humans generally reside, most of the world's population live on about half of the Earth's surface. But the other half, it's the half that we live on, is high quality. And so the other half is low quality, and those are generally referred to as wildlands. So wildlands are areas that humans are not using, are not dominating, and that makes about 22% of ice-free land. So this is not including the Antarctica. And this is unaffected by humans or human activity. So unaffected, that's unaffected by human or human activity. So like forestry, for example, would be a human activity. So the thing about humans is that we use that first principle. So we actually use the highest quality of the environment first. So wildlands are generally low quality. So think about tops of mountains, for example, or maybe deserts like the Mojave Desert, for example. That would be a wildland. Okay. So if we look at where humans live as related to the net primary productivity, we see that humans tend to live in environments that are highly productive. So we see this curve. So we like environments that have a high productivity versus low productivity. Okay, so that is just kind of the relationship that we have with where humans are found and the productivity of the planet. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about aquatic biomes, and aquatic biomes are shaped a little bit differently by some different limiting factors. So they are shaped by salinity, which is the concentration of salt. They're also shaped by temperature, availability of light, so light can only get down through the different layers of the water, so it can only penetrate down so far. So availability of light, and so when water is cloudy, light cannot reach as far down. And then we also have oxygen and nutrients. So sometimes water is so warm and stagnant that we start to lose oxygen levels. When streams run over rocks and they become oxygenated, then that will actually help the type of organisms, the animals, survive because there's more oxygen. And then nutrients are important too, because what tends to happen in water is that the organisms die or they defecate. So think about animals pooping in the water, and all those nutrients will settle down to the bottom. And so how do you get those nutrients back up to where the light is so that organisms can use the nutrients and the light to become productive? Okay, so there tends to be a high area of net primary productivity where nutrients are found in what is called the euphotic zone. So the euphotic zone, think about this word. Eu means good and photic means light. So this means the area where the light can penetrate. So the light penetrates the water. Okay. So the most primary productivity occurs where nutrients return to the euphotic zone. And this increases primary productivity. So the mixing of the water can be mixed by wind and ponds. It could be mixed by going over rocks. It can also be mixed when you get upwelling of water in the oceans. And it can also be mixed where the rivers run into the oceans. And so this is some of the important ideas that we're going to look at when we look at these different aquatic biomes. So when you look at the high primary productivity, you notice that we see the most primary productivity close to the shore. And that's because those are shallow areas where light can penetrate and where there's high nutrients. So when you look in the middle of the ocean, it has very low primary productivity because it has little nutrients. It's kind of like a desert, and in terms of nutrients, and there's very little primary productivity occurring in those areas. You also notice, well, I don't see the Great Barrier Reef here kind of coming around, but high primary productivity also tends to be greatest near the equator than further away from the equator. Okay, so when we look at rivers and streams, these are referred to as lotic biomes. Lotic biomes. And around the lotic biomes, we have riparian habitats or riparian zones. Let's spell that right. Riparian. Okay, so this is actually the area around. It could be land. Sometimes it's referred to as flood land, right? It's the area where we have a transition from the aquatic river, the flood plain, for example, is riparian, to the land. And this is actually really important because the terrestrial environment of the riparian zone can actually affect the stream's water chemistry and the amount of nutrients. So you can think about leaves falling into the river. And it can also affect water temperature. Shading of the streams and leaves falling in and affecting the chemistry of the water. So riparian zones are areas around rivers and streams. That affect water chemistry, light, and nutrients. Okay. So if we look at the organisms that are adapted to this, generally when we look at rivers and streams, we see insects, for example, larvae, and they're adapted to not being swept away. So you can find like little caddisfly larvae, which build a little shelter for themselves by cementing little tiny sand pebbles together. And they have these legs that hook onto the rocks. And so you have to kind of pry them up off the rocks, and then they go back into their shell. We also have crayfish that live in spaces between rocks and can actually swim or move upstream by walking along the surface. And so we see kind of a diversity of aquatic organisms and aquatic invertebrates. So if we look at lakes, lakes are examples of what are called not lotic, but they are lentic ecosystems. Lentic ecosystems. And a person that studies lakes specifically is called a limnologist. So the study of lakes is called limnology. And the lake is interesting because generally it has a shoreline, and the shoreline is referred to as the littoral zone. And I kind of think about litter, like I think about leaves and plants. So this is the littoral zone. And so this is the shallow waters near the shore. So for example, you could have cattails. So you could have some plants that are able to withstand having their roots submerged in water. This also has algae in it, and so this tends to be high primary productivity. We also see things like turtles and ducks and fish and crayfish and frogs and even insects like dragonflies are moving around in the littoral zone. And then when we look at, as it moves away, we have the limnetic zones. So this is away from the shore. And the upper part is called, you don't need to know this, but it's called the epilimnon, or epilimnon. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but anyway, this is where the sunlight penetrates. So this would be the littoral zone. This is the limnetic zone. And then as we move down, we start to get the water becoming more cold. So we start to see a thermocline. And then we could also say that there's lack of dissolved oxygen because there's not a lot of mixing with the air at the surface. And so this would be, for example, a catfish, which is a bottom dweller, bottom feeder. But all the organisms that are photosynthetic would be up here where light can actually penetrate. And so sometimes you see lakes and they are cloudy and they could actually be green. And so a green lake is said to be eutrophic, which means that there's lots of nutrients, right? So this would be a green lake. Right? When you look at it, the waters look green. And this is because there's lots of primary productivity going on because there might be an algae bloom, which can be possibly bad. But so green lakes are highly productive. But you can also see lakes that are blue, and they are said to be oligotrophic. So trophic means feeding, eu means good feeding, oligo means few feeding. So oligo means that there's not a lot of nutrients. And so these tend to be blue lakes. So oftentimes deep lakes are blue in color, whereas shallow lakes tend to be more green. So if you think about Crater Lake, it would be oligotrophic because there's not a lot of algae in the water. So this is a diagram of a high mountain, right? So this is an oligotrophic lake. This would be a eutrophic lake. Okay, so another ecosystem, aquatic ecosystem, is where the freshwater meets saltwater, and this is what are referred to as estuaries. So these are where rivers meet the ocean. And the saltwater becomes diluted with fresh water, and so there's a huge variation in salinity. So we have variation in salinity, and so organisms have to be able to survive this. So we have the mixing of fresh water and salt water, and then we tend to have 3 different habitats. So we have 3 habitats in an estuary. So we have what are called the salt marshes. And this is where grasses can survive. And in the salt marshes, they actually get rid of excess salt by getting they get rid of the excess salt. So that's the salt marshes. And then we have the mud flats. Right? And then we have channels. Okay. So the mud flats are areas where the mud is exposed during low tide, and then the tide can come in. So if you've ever been clamming, for example, on the Oregon coast, this would be the mud flats. And then the channels are where water sometimes flows, and they can be a little bit deeper in those channel areas. Okay. We can also talk about the Oregon coast as being an example of a temperate coastal sea. So temperate means that it's high latitude, and so it tends to be colder than tropical coastal seas. So this would be versus tropical. And when we look at these coastal seas, they are dominated by either rocky bottoms So we have rocky shores. And these rocky shores support animals that can attach onto them. So they support what is referred to as, they support epifauna. So epifauna are organisms that can attach to the surface. Epi means upon, and fauna means animals. Okay, so epifauna. So this would be things like sea stars, sea urchins, barnacles. Okay, so those all attach to the surface, and so they can stay there and they don't get washed away when the tide comes and goes. And so if we look at the sandy shores, there's not as much to see right away because the animals are actually underground. So animals are buried in the sand. Sometimes you can see little bubbles coming up. Sometimes those are animal respiration. So this is what is referred to as infauna. So that's animals buried in the sand. And so this could include clams, small shrimp, which are scavengers, and worms. So we do have worms in the ocean. They are sometimes called clam worms. There's also other types of worms that are tube worms that live, create a little tube for themselves. And so the intertidal zones are those zones that where the tide comes in, and so they're covered in water part of the time, and then the tide moves out and they dry out. And then you have the tide pools. So the tide pools are found in the intertidal zones. Okay, so we have tide pools found in intertidal zones. Okay, so this is as opposed to the coastal, the tropical, but here's a diagram or an image that shows the sea stars, right? These are drying out. So this is the intertidal zone. When the tide comes in, they will be covered back up. This is the sand. Organisms are buried in that sand, so you can't see them as readily as the ones that are attached to the rocky surface. Okay, so let's look at the tropical coastal seas. And so these include coral reefs. And the one thing that's really interesting about the coral reefs is that the reefs themselves are hard, rocky, and they are actually created by animals. So the rocky structures are created by animals. And they secrete, corals will secrete calcium carbonate. So carbonate, the carbon. So this is one way that the carbon gets stored in coral reefs. So this is a storage for carbon. This is like hard outer shells of organisms are oftentimes calcium carbonate. And so this is what makes up limestone. So sometimes those shallow seas become mountains, or they even become desert. And we also see marble. So if you've ever been to Death Valley, it's not marble. If you've ever been to Death Valley, that's marble. And you've been down some of those slot canyons, or, you know, that was once a shallow sea, and those were deposited by sea creatures, and then the sea went away, but we're left with marble. Okay, so this deposition of calcium carbonate is really slow, but the coral reefs can grow very big. And what they're doing here is they're creating a habitat. So they're actually creating shallow seas which have a high primary productivity. So these are like the, so that's not gonna let me write there. High primary productivity, man. These are like the rainforests of the ocean. Okay, just write high primary productivity. Okay. So one of the things about the reefs is that they are very protective of the mainland. And so here you can see, this is the reef structure, right? Shallow, this is a lagoon. And so when storms come in, lots of their energy is actually protecting, so it actually hits the coral reef first. And so a lot of the energy doesn't actually make it to the shoreline. So coral reefs are really important from protecting. So if you think about the Great Barrier Reef around Australia, protecting, right? But they also have this huge high primary productivity, and they have created this environment where other organisms survive. So one of the things about the waters is that you see that they tend to not be cloudy. So we have clear water. Okay. So we could ask, well, where is the algae? How come there isn't like when we see green lakes, why isn't there green in the waters? And that's because the nutrients that is in the coral reef is recycled really, really rapidly. So if something dies, the nutrients are broken down and taken back up by the organisms really fast. And the algae is actually incorporated inside the coral. So the coral are little animals, and they actually feed on small organisms. So the coral they feed. They're not plants, they're actually animals, and they actually have stinging cells, so they're actually related to jellyfish. So the coral feed on small animals, and they provide the algae with nitrogen. The algae, on the other hand, use light energy to obtain their nutrients. Let me go back, sorry. So they use light energy to obtain carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Okay, so the algae provide the coral with sugar. So that would be like a carbohydrate, sugar like glucose. Okay. Oh man, I don't want to go to another page. Okay. Back up. Oh, frustrating. Okay. Sorry about that. So this is, they provide them with sugar. So this is an example of a mutualistic symbiosis. So mutualistic means both species benefit, and symbiosis means they live together. So you could have a parasitic symbiosis, which is where only one benefits and the other has a cost. But this is, the algae are not parasites. They're actually doing the coral good because they're providing them with sugar, which then can then be used to build the reef. So if we look at image here, these are the little coral polyps. They're very, very tiny, but they have tentacles that have stinging cells in them. And then they also have the zooanthellae. So these are the algae that are living inside of their tissues, and then that helps them build this exoskeleton of calcium carbonate, lays it down, and it creates the reef, bringing the bottom up towards the light so that there can be more photosynthesis occurring. Now, one of the problems that we've seen in recent years, and you might have heard about this in terms of the Great Barrier Reef, is that we see a problem of what is called coral bleaching. And this is specifically due to increased temperature of water. So this is due to the increased temperature of water. And this is believed to be related to climate change. And it causes the coral to eject. So the coral eject their algae. And this causes a temporary loss of color. And they can regain algae, and they might do it in order to, if their algae start to die, they start to produce a toxic substance. And so they might eject the algae because their algae are dying, and they might be hoping to get new algae that might be better able to survive in this new environment, which is a warming temperature. But sometimes coral bleaching occurs, and it causes the entire reef to die. And when the reef dies, then it can no longer support all the animals that are dependent upon the reef. And so the coral bleaching is primarily due to differences in temperature. This is our government, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, talking about the loss of color in the coral reefs. Okay, so generally, the open ocean, as I mentioned before, is relatively unproductive. It has little net primary productivity, except for where we have upwellings. And we talked about upwellings when we talked about El Nino, because El Nino prevents upwellings from occurring off the coast of North America and off the coast of South America. So the upwellings specifically are cold, nutrient-rich waters coming to the surface. And these provide nutrients that are necessary. And so this can create environments that are very diverse and very productive. And so if we look at an example of this, this might be sardines. They talk about the Peruvian fisheries in your book. But this just talks about the water coming in, the cold water comes in, it brings nutrient rich, and then you kind of get this burst of phytoplankton and zooplankton, which are little tiny crustaceans, and then fish come in to feed upon the crustaceans, and then other organisms follow to feed upon the larger fish. And it just kind of creates this amazing diversity in areas where upwelling occurs. The last one is the open ocean. And so when we look at the open ocean, we can look at the different layers as it represents the amount of light that can actually penetrate. And you might have heard of these fish that live in the bottom of the open ocean that actually use bioluminescent little lures. So the open ocean itself is relatively nutrient poor, and so it tends to be blue, right? So blue in color. So you could say that it is oligotrophic, which means nutrient poor. And there's not a lot of algae that are, or phytoplankton that are in the water at any great density to make it look green. And then we have this first zone corresponds primarily to the amount of light that reaches down, right? So this is where most of the light is. This is where most of the animals are. So this is the euphotic zone, which is called the epipelagic. And this is where most animals live. And then when we move downward, the amount of light penetrating gets smaller and smaller. And so we have animals here that either are blind or they create their own light in order to see. So that's the open ocean. Okay, so that's it for the summary of the terrestrial and aquatic biomes for global ecology and conservation biology.